we're asking for change. We're asking for land use change. The systems of land management we've had for the last 150 odd years, our grandparents have provided us with excellent landscapes to meet the needs of this generation. And now we're going to need different landscapes to meet the need of the next couple of generations. And that means change. And you have to base that change on evidence.
Welcome to our latest Hutton Highlights podcast. I'm Elaine Maslin, Media Officer here at the James Hutton Institute. Through our podcast, we bring you a glimpse into our world-leading research across food, energy and environmental security. For this episode, we're taking a look at climate change in the Cairngorms National Park. When we talk or think about climate change, it's often at a global or national scale. But for managers of large-scale land areas like a national park, a more detailed understanding is needed, both of how the climate has changed and is changing. That helps organisations manage and adapt to those changes. For the Cairngorms National Park Authority, the goal is a resilient landscape where people and nature can coexist and thrive well into the future. So they came to us to help understand how the climate has already changed in the Cairngorms and what might be expected in the decades to come, right out to 2080. To delve into this work and what it means for the park, I went over to Granton-on-Spey and I met Andy Ford, Director of Nature and Climate Change at the Cairngorms National Park Authority. Joining me to help unpack the climate science was Dr. Mike Rivington, a senior scientist here at the Hutton who has been working on land use and climate change for more than 20 years. Andy, first, could you tell us a bit about yourself and your role?
Yeah, hi. I've been with the Park Authority now for almost 20 years, although I've only been Director of Nature and Climate Change for about just over two. And I guess it's just a really exciting time to be working on nature and climate change. The park has a really key role to play in demonstrating what we're able to do to tackle the twin crisis. We've a really strong track record of showing leadership through difficult conversations and through complex conversations. And there's a really good opportunity here to be out in front of all of this and to be innovative and to demonstrate what a future can look like where we're adapting to climate change.
Yes, and I guess that's part of what triggered the park to have this work done by the Hutton. And what are some of the reasons for getting this detail from us, digging into that climate piece on what's been happening to the park in terms of climate change?
Yeah, so we broadly know at a national and global scale that we're going to get warmer, wetter winters and we're going to get hotter, drier summers. But actually what's really important is having that geographically specific, strong evidence base for us to understand what it means for the here and for the now so that we can inform our immediate actions, but also with that longer term view, that ability to look out to the 2040s, 50s, 60s, so that we know that what we're taking in the short term is still going to help us adapt and be more resilient in the long term. The data is really important for us to help prioritise, to help us target, and also to help us justify the kind of things that we're doing, because if we're going to make it meaningful, if we're going to make it stick, then we really have to consider the people who it'll impact, and we really have to consider the people that we need to take with us. So having that strong evidence base not only helps us make a decision, but it helps other people, it gives them reassurance that what we're doing is the right thing.
I guess you're already seeing some of the impacts of climate change yourself here. What sort of things have been happening?
Yeah, so we've seen a much increased rainfall over this autumn and winter. We've seen a lot more flooding. We had Storm Babbitt over here that caused quite a lot of damage to flood banks on the Spey. We're also seeing those hotter, drier summers, and we know that there were the wildfires, for example, over at Canich, and we had some smaller fires here in the national park. So we know that these events are happening already, and it's helping us inform action against those kind of events, like the integrated fire management plan we're doing, like the work on flood bank survey we're doing, things like that.
And you've got various projects as well that maybe this will help towards targets like the Cairngorms 2030 and some of the carbon audit work that you're doing?
Yeah, so Cairngorms 2030 is largely about us being the first net zero national park. There's a lot of peatland restoration going on, a lot of woodland expansion going on, And we also need to bring in the much more holistic picture around active and sustainable travel, about empowering people to be able to take their part in tackling the twin crisis.
So let's turn to Mike for the main findings. Mike, what stood out for you and what are the implications of those findings for the park?
The main finding was that there's going to be increasing variability in the future, and we've seen evidence of that already. And as Andy has sort of mentioned, that warmer, wetter winters is one thing, but what we've been trying to do is sort of narrow down to the park area specific details. So what we found is things like temperature has gone up by up to 2 degrees in February and a little bit into March. And conversely, in September, we're seeing much drier months. So what we're really seeing is the sort of change in the seasonality that we would normally expect. The patterns of the climate are changing, and the quantities of what we're having in terms of heavy precipitation events are changing. So we may have more flooding events, but we may also have additional dry periods, and that raises concerns about the risks of fires. The other thing that we've noticed at a national scale, and that's sort of replicated within the park area, is a change in the west to east rainfall gradient. We normally know that the west of Scotland is wet and the east is slightly drier, and that to some extent exists within the park as well. But what we're seeing in terms of the evidence of analysis of the historical data and then the future climate projections is that will become more accentuated. So areas to the east of the Cairngorms may become drier in the future. Another key finding is that what we've experienced already is in line with what the climate projections were showing out to 2050. By that I mean that the amount of climate change we have already experienced in some cases is more than what the climate models were projecting out to 2050. So climate change has already happened. And what concerns me most is the increasing probability of the chances of what we might call back-to-back poor years. For example, 2 drought years in a row. Nature and our own economic systems can recover from odd extreme years if there's a period of stability afterwards. But nature may well struggle if we have back-to-back drought years, and that will put challenges in terms of how we then conserve and manage those natural resources.
I think that's a really good point, actually, about the back-to-back years. We talk about adaptation quite a lot, and we talk about mitigation, and actually all of those is wrapped up in resilience. And if we're going to have healthy, functioning systems that need to be resilient, then we need to look in the long term. We need to look across the 5 to 10 years. Of course, we used to have things like the Muckle Spate. And yes, you've got things like Storm Frank, these really high-impact events. But what we're seeing as well is a higher frequency, low impact events. But when you put those back to back, when you put those month to month, year to year, that's the kind of resilience that we really need to build into the system that will help us adapt.
So what are some of the implications of those changes on the park?
If I put it into 3 broad categories, one around sort of floods and droughts, another around wildfire, and another around species and nature networks and things like that. Floods and droughts, so as I say, we know that we're seeing more land flooded through the autumn and winter periods, and we know that we're seeing more droughts in the summer periods. So we need to make sure that we combine our peatland restoration with our woodland expansion, with our riparian planting, with our river restoration, so that all of those are targeted at better water management to some extent. The increased risk of wildfires, so that again is a great concern. These are some of Scotland's biggest and best Caledonian pine woods. They're not everywhere, and that's a huge natural heritage asset that we're charged with looking after. We've got an integrated wildfire management plan being written at the moment, and we're just going through the process of seeing if a fire bylaw would reduce that risk of ignition. I think if I look at the species stuff, so we know we've had catastrophic declines in freshwater pearl mussel. We know that we've got species that are on the edge of their range altitudinally that will simply not have anywhere else to go. And we know that we've got species migrations that we're going to need to build stronger nature networks for them to adapt and move around to. So already it's starting to impact the way that we look at land management in the way that we look at conservation in the park.
If we maybe sort of slightly roll back before we go into depth a bit more on some of those, some people might hear wildfire risk, drought and flooding all in the same sentence and wonder if that seems a bit counterintuitive in somewhere like Scotland that's perceived as being pretty wet. So how can we have flooding and drought, and how does that work? Surely there's enough water. So Mike, could you explain a bit about why we're seeing all of these in somewhere like Scotland?
I think we need to change our sort of perceptions of what we call pretty wet. Scotland can be quite wet, particularly over on the west coast, but over here on the eastern half of Scotland, we do also have quite dry periods. And it doesn't take very much in terms of a prolonged dry period to get us into drought situations. Certainly our analysis has shown that in the spring months there's an increasing number of consecutive dry days, and that only needs to add up in some of the more extreme years to periods when we have dry conditions, particularly coming out of the winter when there's lots of dead, dry material from vegetation to form the fuel for fires. And then, as happened with the Cannock fire, an accidental fire got out of control because of the dry conditions and the amount of fuel available. Conversely, with the flooding, is that there's increasing probability of the storm events, but also for every 1 degree temperature rise, the atmosphere can hold 7% more water. So what I have already experienced is an increase in storm intensity and rainfall intensity that causes these flooding events. So overall, I think we just need to change our perceptions of what we call pretty wet, and that actually what we need to be looking at is just pretty variable, and we are likely to go from one extreme to the other, even within the same year or possibly even within the same season.
And how we manage this variability is a lot around how we manage our systems and our land. So that comes back to Andy. Let's talk about some of the things that we can do and that are being done in the park. Could you maybe talk about some of the solutions that you are already implementing here in the Cairngorms?
Yeah, that point about it being, what does pretty wet mean, and us having rainfall, but the variability just makes me think of one particular scenario in the Dee catchment where it's not a case of are we getting enough water, it's a case of when we're getting it, are we holding on to it so it doesn't all end up in the North Sea. It's the fact that we need to retain water in the upper catchment. So that's where we're looking at a Dee resilience or adaptation strategy that brings together all the public agencies with all those different remits around water quality, water quantity, protecting people and property, about restoring functioning ecosystems. All of these different strategic objectives are aligned around the same big, broad outcomes of climate change adaptation. So that's what the Park Authority is doing in the Dee, is saying, well, what can we do? Where do you get your biggest bang for buck with the public pound? If you combine peatland restoration with woodland expansion, with greater structural diversity in moorlands, etc., what does that add up to in the whole? And how does that help us adapt and be more resilient to the effects of climate change? So that's one thing we're doing on the floods and droughts side of it. On the fire management, I've mentioned the bylaws already, but I think that's a really important thing to come back to, because we can reduce the risk of ignition. So it's partly about adapting, but it's also about how our behaviour can reduce the risks, because these things have happened. That because the climate is changing, will change even more, the way that we interact with nature is really, really important. And I guess that's where the bylaws come in, is that they really encourage that behavioural change, so that the way that we interact with nature helps us all adapt to the changing environment, the changing conditions that we're living in.
And then are there wider, sort of longer term things you can do around wildfire as well? So if it does happen, preventing faster spread and so on and so forth, longer term trees and resilience?
Yeah, so the integrated fire management plan that we're working on looks at the three key components of that, really. First of all, I guess, is prevention, and that's where the bylaw comes in, that's where ranger patrols come in, that's where we make sure that the risk of ignition is as low as possible. The second bit is response. So if a wildfire does get away, how are we going to respond to that? Do we have the right training in the park? Do we have the right people in the right places? Have we got the right equipment that we need? Are the communications channels effective? That kind of response. And then the final bit to the plan, which is actually one of the most challenging bits, is how do we build resilience to the increased risk of fire into a changing landscape? Because we have all of these priorities around woodland expansion, around more natural functioning systems, but inevitably in some places at certain times that means an increase in the fuel load. So how do you manage that period when there will be an increased fuel load risk, but actually the longer term goal and the longer term outcome of wetter systems which ultimately are more resilient, more natural systems which deliver across a whole range of public benefits, how do you manage the increased fuel load in the short to medium term? And that's the really interesting question that we've got to crack. And going back to saying about what it's interesting about working in a national park, that's a national issue that maybe we're going to have to try and crack in the national park.
Just to sort of slightly expand on what do you mean by fuel load? So not everyone might understand what fuel load is. Yep. Maybe Mike can answer that.
Yes, we're at the James Hutton Institute. We're developing a new fire modelling system to develop for advanced warning. So part of that includes modelling the fuel load, which is the accumulation of things like dead heather and other vegetation material that can build up during the winter. Although it might be wet through the winter, in the spring it can dry out, and that's when you have the higher risk of fires occurring. We've also developed a new approach to modelling the available water at sort of ground surface level. We call it the climatic water balance. And that is simply the difference between precipitation, rainfall that falls out of the sky, and what is evaporated back up into the atmosphere. And that helps set the level of water that's available in soils and in plants, and will serve to inform us about the risks of drought and fire as well. So using these advanced sort of modelling capabilities, we're able to do that for the now, but also using the climate projections to try and understand what that will look like in the future. And as Andy has said, it's trying to identify the right place for doing the right conservation activities, so we can identify where maybe at greater risk from, say, future desiccation because of this loss of water from the system, but also where the opportunities are for managing the ecosystems to try and keep that amount of water in the system.
We've been talking about wildfires and looking after nature and the landscape, but we haven't talked much about the people in it and who use it for recreation, business, whatever it might be. How do you manage that balance in the work that you do?
Yeah, the park's a living, working landscape. Every hectare of land is managed in one way or another. But equally, every hectare of land in Scotland has to play its part in tackling the twin crisis. The balance is, how do you find space for land to meet the needs of people and nature? How can we find a way of living alongside nature and nature-based solutions to the twin crisis, rather than compartmentalizing them and saying that bit of the land adapts to the climate crisis and this bit of the land delivers for forestry or agriculture or moorland management?
And does that speak to something like reintroduction of species like beavers and managing different stakeholders within that?
Yeah, I guess that's a good example actually of how we manage to live alongside beavers, because beavers can be a really important part of the answer. They provide a lot of nature-based solutions to flooding. They increase resilience and storage in the upper catchments. They increase biodiversity. But equally, they can bring problems for land managers, particularly in agriculture. So how do you find a way of making sure that we can get the benefits, maximise the benefits, and minimise the impacts? Beavers is a really good example. Here in the National Park, we've got a really good, strong mitigation and management plan, which essentially says, if this beaver isn't causing you any problems, then let's find a way of living with it. But if it's impacting on your business, if it's having an impact on people and property, then yeah, let's get in there. Let's try and mitigate it. Let's try and manage it. That is people and nature thriving together rather than trying to find one bit of land providing all the solutions to one bit of society and another bit of land providing all the solutions to another bit of society, because we all need to play a part in this. We all need to have agency in the decision making, because we've all got a vested interest in Scotland and our national parks being able to adapt to the climate crisis. We've got the Cairngorms 2030 programme, and that's essentially targeted at that. How can we be the first net zero national park as a place where people feel as though they have direct involvement, feel connection to nature, feel empowered to be a part of that process?
Is it a bit like a big puzzle? So maybe something like the beavers is one little bit a jigsaw in this bigger puzzle, but there's a wider picture and it's a holistic issue across the park.
Absolutely. No one's suggesting that beavers are going to be the solution to adapting to floods and droughts. Peatland restoration won't be the solution to it all. Riparian planting, forest expansion won't be the solution to it all. Even the combined effects won't be the single answer. The way that we use, live on, recreate in, rely on the land of Scotland is fundamentally important, that we treat that at a landscape scale and that we make sure that there are benefits to people as well as benefits to nature.
So, Mike, you're the one that models this data that we've been sharing about the climate, and this is something you've been working on for more than 25 years. How much is what you can offer changed, and how powerful is that now to large landholdings like the Cairngorms?
With the development of computing capacity, climate models, better understanding of the climate system, and our ability to integrate multiple data sets, we do really have the ability now to have a fairly reliable look into the future. We might gloriously call it the science of foresight, that sort of ability to look over the horizon using computer models, using expert knowledge, and integrate that into some sort of vision of what the future actually looks like. And that capacity has increased greatly over the 25 odd years that I've been working in this area. And we can use that knowledge to inform authorities like the national park authorities and large land estates on what the future actually looks like. And with some increasing certainty, there's always going to be some uncertainty in what the future will bring. But with our modelling capabilities, we can actually try and capture some of that uncertainty and turn it round the other way to say, okay, this is our best knowledge. This is how we can move forwards in terms of developing approaches that climate-proof the actions that we do now, because there is enough energy stored in our oceans at the moment to take us past 1.5 degrees. We are probably going to see much more like 2 degrees temperature warning by the end of the century at least. So when we talk about peatland restoration and woodland creation, we need to climate-proof that. So the actions that we do now are valid and useful 10, 20, 30, 50 years into the future. So that ability to do that sort of distant future look and use that as a basis for planning purposes, I think it's the big advance that I've seen in my years. But we can also bring the scale right down to individual land and estates. So, for example, we can provide indications to landowners at their estate level about what the future of climate might actually look like on their area of land. And then the same applies. They can start to think about how they might do things like manage to try and retain water in the upper catchment to prevent flooding, but also to retain water so in periods of drought there is more of a slow release. What might happen in terms of the changes in the vegetation and how that can be utilised to enhance biodiversity. So with all the advances in science that we're seeing, we are forewarned, and forewarned is forearmed, so hopefully we can make better informed decisions. And also we can visualise a lot of these things, so they serve as really quite useful mediums for then discussions with the local communities, landowners, etc., farmers, foresters, to help try and create that picture and use those as mediums for discussion of actually coming to some sort of consensus in terms of what the best future actions are going to be.
And are you seeing people like the park, starting to use some of this data and acting on it and taking measures? So for things like in agriculture, water storage.
Yes, the Cairngorms National Park Authority commissioned me a few years ago to do a study on changes in snow cover, for example, due to the climate projections. And that study showed that, unfortunately, in the future, we are likely to see less snow cover. There will still be some winters when there's quite a bit of snow, and there will be certainly winter snowstorms. But overall, there will be less snow cover, and that has an impact on vegetation. It changes what we call the albedo effect. White surfaces reflect heat, whereas exposed, darker surfaces absorb heat energy. That then has impacts on the water temperature, and that then feeds through to streams, salmon, and all the other aquatic biodiversity as well. So that information is feeding into the thought processes of places like the national parks, but landowners and other businesses as well. So that this ability to sort of project forward into the future is feeding into people's thinking processes and decision making. Yeah, we're developing new tools that help decision making. A good example is a thing called the river tool, and that helps people plan where they may do riparian planting. That's planting trees along the courses of burns and rivers, and that's important in terms of helping to keep the temperature cooler, but then also providing input into the river systems that help aquatic biodiversity.
That's a really good example. Those maps of river temperatures, we've been using those to work with the catchment management partnerships in the park and also the East Cairngorms Moorland Partnership to target riparian planting. Where can we make the biggest difference? Because we know we need to act here. We know we need to act now with urgency. We can prioritise resources where we have the most affected systems and then take the long-term view and work on the other bits as and when time allows.
I guess that's quite a challenge as well. You need to act now, and sometimes you can't wait on data. You have to move, but you can have the data to underpin what you're doing as well.
Yeah, we're asking for change. We're asking for land use change. The systems of land management we've had for the last 150 odd years, our grandparents have provided us with excellent landscapes to meet the needs of this generation. And now we're going to need different landscapes to meet the need of the next couple of generations, and that means change. And you have to base that change on evidence. And you have to be able to say, we know what we're doing, and we know why we're doing it, and we need to be able to reassure that it's the right thing to do. And to do that, you need data, you need evidence, you need empirical data, but that might take years, if not decades, to gather. Trends don't happen overnight. Variance in data doesn't get cleansed overnight. So how do you act with speed, with urgency, at scale, when there are still questions in the science? It's a really important question.
And is that sort of a conservation question generally as well? It's always been a challenge. You don't quite know what the outcome's going to be when you first start on something.
Yeah, I think it is. So freshwater pearl mussel, we know that climate change impacts have had a serious impact on the population. We're probably going to need radical interventions to save the species, but we don't have the science to say that they're going to be 100% successful. So we're going to have a bigger risk appetite on these things because we can't afford to wait for the data, which is why we have a freshwater pearl mussel action plan that says, right, let's give this a go, and we have to be prepared to get it wrong, but at least the science we're generating from this now will inform future science. Mike mentioned the science of foresight, and that struck me as being a really good way of looking at it because we can't wait, and also we can't afford to monitor decline. We need to do it differently, and we need to start looking forwards, not just maintaining the long-term data sets we've got at the moment and watching how things are declining.
Yeah, relying on getting that empirical data can ultimately mean just watching decline if you don't act on it. Yeah. So we've covered quite a lot of ground there. If people want to find out any more information about anything you've touched on, where should people go? Mike?
The James Hutton website has a lot of material, particularly around issues to do with climate change and natural capital. If you Google climate change impacts on natural capital, you'll get through to some reports that we've produced where we've looked at the climate trends and future projections and extremes. Another useful source for the climatic information is the UK Met Office. I'm a great fan of their climate anomaly maps. They show how things have changed in month by month, and it's a really interesting way of putting things into context of how much has changed and how different our weather is now compared to the past. Another useful site for global context is Copernicus. So if you Google Copernicus, you'll come up with some really interesting graphics about changes in ocean temperature, and that helps set useful information in terms of understanding how our planet is changing.
It's a bit simpler for me. I'll just say cairngorms.co.uk, and we've got a page specifically around climate change and climate change adaptation.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So I'll wrap up there. I want to thank our guests, Andy Ford and Dr. Mike Rivington. Thank you also to you, the listeners, for joining us. We hope this episode gave you a glimpse into the challenges of managing landscape-scale environments like the Cairngorms for nature and people in a changing climate. Do like and share the podcast, and of course subscribe to us on your podcast platform of choice. Just search Hutton Highlights Podcast. Until next time, stay safe.